Daniel's 70th week, one of the most controversial topics in end times theology. And finally, I have an expert to help explain it to me. So with me is Carmine Hetrick, and he has been exploring and studying Daniel quite a bit. He's got a YouTube channel called Daniel Reloaded. You can find him on YouTube, where he has some extensive videos on the topic. And so I am very curious and interested to understand the depths of how should we understand the 70th week of Daniel. Is it all past and done, or should we expect a future 70th week to come? So with that, Carmine, welcome to the channel.
Hey, Adam. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, you seem to be another one of the group of the independent thinkers on the internet. And so I've almost been thinking about a coalition of serious Bible thinkers that need to gather together.
Yep. That sounds appealing to me too.
Now, I'm curious. Just as we get started, like, is there a particular church background that you come from, or is that not too important? And it's okay if it's not.
A particular church background, like something that kind of pushed me in the direction that I seem to have settled on, or are you asking what kind of led me to the particular studies that I do, or
Yeah, just wondering just a little bit about yourself in general to some degree. But because you know what, all of us,
okay.
I'll give you an example. Like for myself, I actually grew up in a lot of Baptist churches. And then I ended up going to more non-denominational churches. And then finally I ended up for a little while, I was attending I was a member of a, non-denominational, but with a charismatic leaning church. And so each one of these churches has seriously shaped my outlook. And I have definitely come to find that they are completely different when it comes to many aspects of how to study the Bible, what to think about the Bible, all those types of views. And so I didn't know if you had any influences that,
Right.
kind of shaped your being and how you've come to be today.
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely lots of influences. I guess I would say that, as far as my upbringing in that, well, I was raised in a professing Christian home. We really didn't go to church, and I really had no idea who Jesus even was. That's how aloof we were about that. But at a young age, I took an interest in science, especially astronomy, and I was fascinated with astrophysics. Not that I really understood a lot of it then, but it still fascinated me. I thought astronomy was really cool, and just learning about the universe, where it came from, how it worked, and things like that. And when you're in that kind of environment, doing those kinds of studies, it's hard to avoid getting a lot of secular influences, where scientists and stuff, they have a lot of materialistic views on the origin of the universe, and all that stuff sounded plausible to me, and I didn't really know that that it could potentially be in conflict with anything faith-wise, because, like I said, I didn't really have much of a relationship with Christ at the time, really any relationship. Like I said, I didn't know who he even really was, other than just a good moral teacher. But then there were some events in my life that kind of personal events, but they got me interested in the question about God, and it some personal tragedy that caused my parents to begin going to church. And as far as the specific church, it was a Baptist church, and that's where I really learned about Jesus, who he was, who he claimed to be, who people believed he really was, and that totally shocked me. I had no idea that people actually believed Jesus was God in the flesh. In some ways, it really interested me, but in other ways, it's like, wow, I can't believe people actually believe this. It seemed really silly to me in some respects. But the more I thought about it, it's like, wow, that would be cool if you could prove that was really true. That'd be something. So it was at that point, I don't know, I was probably 16 or 17 when I started going to the Baptist church there. And I was really conflicted. I was worried at the time, having first thought about my relationship with God and perhaps my eternal destination. I didn't know. I didn't want to make the wrong decision. I didn't want to choose the wrong religion and potentially upset God with me forever, and seal my fate from the get-go. So while I was interested in Christianity, I wasn't entirely sold on it, and I was desperately trying to find a way to prove whatever religion I was trying to find the true religion. Christianity sounded good, but again, I didn't want to make a mistake. I didn't want to be just catered to my emotions and believe it specifically because of that. I wanted some sort of proof. Prophecy was presented to me as a way that you could prove that Christianity was true. And the more I got to studying it, the more confused I got. And I eventually, some of my earliest influences were just the books that I got off the shelf of our local bookstore, like Hal Lindsey, typical dispensationalist stuff, And I tried reading it. I think I got like an updated version of his late great Planet Earth, the 2000 AD version of it. Will Mankind Survive? And I read through that, and a lot of interesting stuff, but it didn't make heads or tails to me how they were getting the explanations they were out of the biblical text. So it kind of put me off of the prophecy stuff. At the time, I was into young Earth creationism because it sounds like I think you had maybe an early influence with Kent Hovind there, with your debate with him, and I certainly had a early influence from him too. Our church, the Baptist church, had a lot of his videos in stock there. So he influenced me early in convincing me that it was important that we be able to demonstrate that the young Earth view was correct, because that was the biblical view according to him. I've since abandoned that. I don't believe that's that's correct in any way, shape, or form now. But yeah, I just got into general apologetics at that point. But then that was in late high school. I went to college at that point, and that's when I was sincerely trying to become a good apologist. But the more I got to studying, the more difficult I found it to convince myself that what I had accepted, because I had been baptized. I actually made the decision to get baptized, but then I really started questioning that decision more once I went to college, and I began reading the rebuttals to a lot of the early apologists that I had listened to, and I felt that I just kind of backslid. If that's possible for somebody who is a Christian as young as me, didn't have much to slide back to. But anyways, I put Christianity in the back burner for the majority of my college years. It wasn't until I got my first job, until I graduated college, I got my first job. I had some, freedom, because I'm a software developer. Okay, so we have some luxuries, when we're sitting at a desk all day just writing code, and that we have some luxuries where we can just listen to, audio programs and stuff like that. And I guess one of my earliest influences too was Hank Hanegraaff, the Bible answer man. Before he
Oh
turned
yeah,
Eastern Orthodox, I listened to him on a local radio
he
station,
did.
and
Oh my
I
gosh, I
really
did not
liked
hear that.
him because. Oh yes, yeah. He did. I think it was around 2017. He announced his conversion. Although he was dropping hints left and right before then that he was toying with Eastern Orthodox. But yes, he did convert around 2017. But he was a significant influence on me early on, and even in some of my current beliefs, he was a strong influence on me. So, anyways, after I had put Christianity in the back burner and then had a revived interest in it after getting married, getting my first real job, and having a couple of kids, I realized, oh man, I wish I wanted my kids to have an upbringing, like a more Christian upbringing than I did. And I thought maybe that could make a difference for them, that maybe they wouldn't have the struggles and trials with faith that they did, or that I did in their life. And that maybe if I hadn't had more answers for them up front, maybe they wouldn't struggle so much. So I got interested in apologetics a little bit, and I remembered my early experiences with Hank, and I found he was on a local radio station to the location we moved to, and began listening to him. And every now and then I noticed he'd have altercation with some dispensationalist callers and stuff, and he started questioning them on where they saw all of these things in the Bible, because Hank, he's a partial preterist, okay? And it just shocked me that he would question what I thought were just staples of the Christian faith. And it's like, how could this guy educate people against cults and false teachings and stuff when he's peddling this stuff himself? But I kept listening to him, thinking, well, it's just he's got some other good stuff here. I'm going to focus on the positive in that. It's probably more of an emotional connection, I think, just from my early childhood than anything. I just enjoyed listening to him. I liked his program. But after a while, he had several of these altercations. I realized, he's making some interesting points here. Maybe I should learn a little bit more about what he has to say. He had advertisements in his program for a book called The Apocalypse Code: What the Bible Really Says About the End Times. And in that book, that book was just an eye opener for me. I got the audio version of it so I could listen to it while I was at work, and he exposed all of the issues with dispensationalism, and cured me of that. So that really lit a spark for me that got me interested in Bible prophecy again, because I felt that I really could understand it, that it was within my grasp. And after that, it was just a firestorm of research, and I had a really rejuvenated spirit at that point. And I was teaching this stuff at a Bible study that we had in where I worked, and it was getting very well received. But I found out when I got to teaching other books of the Bible, because I started teaching the book of Revelation, but when I got to teaching other books like Daniel and other things, I found it really difficult, because I couldn't find a lot of people that had good explanations for a lot of Daniel. It seemed like they had, from a preterist or a partial preterist perspective, Revelation made so much more sense to me. But there's a lot of overlap between Revelation and Daniel, and I just could not make any sense out of that. So went back to my friend Hank there and asked him for some pointers, and he shed some light on the book of Daniel, gave me some perspectives on it I had never had before, and referred me to a book called God in Control by Dr. Robert Gurney. And I did a video. I think you've familiar with that video on the prophecy of the kings of the north and south there. He actually was the one who recommended Dr. Gurney's work to me, and that book too made a lot more sense out of Daniel. But I want to cut this short, but this is kind of important because it really did shape where I am today, because I had a run-in with full preterism. After I got to studying a lot, I was left wondering, what is really left to be fulfilled here? And I didn't realize all of the implications of full preterism, but as far as it related to the general resurrection and things like that. But I just felt that it looked like everything had been fulfilled early on, and I wasn't sure what was really left to be fulfilled. I was left with the impression that the New Testament authors really were trying to say that everything had been fulfilled. I was convinced of it, but it was all of the highs that I felt when I was first introduced to preterism. When I went to full preterism, I suddenly lost all of that because I realized I felt like the New Testament authors were trying too hard to show that everything was fulfilled, that it was just that they were too easily impressed with the claimed fulfillments that they had. And I had a real crisis of faith after that, that while the Bible was certainly clearer to me than it ever had been before, it wasn't any more believable to me. So again, I slid back. I had this relapse into a weakened faith, where I was really just an agnostic at that point. And there, I don't know the exact sequence of events, but there were things that drew me back to the study every now and then. I'd hear something, or a thought would pop into my head, and I'd just jump back to these studies a little bit, because I was still, I guess, a little intrigued by Christianity, although I wasn't really convinced anymore that it was true. I still found it kind of interesting, and it was at that point where I had some just revelations about concerning the book of Daniel, and I realized that there were some things that Dr. Gurney had documented about Daniel that really were true, but I could just never demonstrate it before. And all of a sudden, the symbols and stuff started clicking and coming together, and it changed my attitude about what I thought, what the Bible was actually teaching, because for the first time I had actually seen evidence that the Bible was divine in origin, that it wasn't purely the product of human intellect and efforts, or just the outcome of self-fulfilling prophecy. That there was something tangible there that you could say no human would ever write like this. Nobody who's trying to convince somebody that the Bible is true, or that their God is truly the God, would write in such a convoluted, obscure manner. But when you would look at all of the symbols and see how they tied together, you could realize that was definitely the intent of the author. But it's certainly not something that people would do, trying to convince somebody, quickly that their God was the God who could actually see the future and predict impressive events. What I was seeing was totally different from that. It was something that, it was almost like the prophets in many ways gave you reason to expect that they were wrong. Okay, they actually made themselves look wrong. And why would a human do that? But I could see how a God who's in total control of history and knows that somehow his word is going to what, and someday somebody's going to understand this stuff. I could see how that could be evidence of God, provided you could demonstrate that was truly God's intent. And I really felt that I was getting to the point where I could do that. So from there, it was just more and more connections that I was making, and I just took on a whole new view of prophecy, and I I was still very sympathetic to some of my preterist leanings, but I realized there was much more to it that preterists will not accept. They just take it off the table right from the very beginning, and I'm no longer willing to do that. I think there are some things that we are intended to detect, like infer from the text. Like there are certain things that the text of the Bible, especially prophecy, implies that it doesn't necessarily say outright, but you can prove that that's really what the author was intending to do. Maybe that's not entirely clear to you or your audience right now, but I think maybe as we go through some of these things in the 70 weeks, maybe some of it will become clear. So sorry, I know it was maybe a little longer than you wanted to go on an introduction there, but I think it's kind of important because I'm sure I'm going to get accused of eisegesis left and right, okay, for some of the stuff I'm about to cover here. But I didn't reach these conclusions lightly, and I tried to be as diligent as I could to guard myself against reading things into the text that simply weren't there. But I'm to the point now where there's no convincing me that what I can show in some of these texts is not what the author actually intended, even though it's not been noticed by virtually anybody that I've encountered.
So that's one of the things I love about your story is, number one, how much it resonates with me and my experiences in Genesis 3. Now, I don't know if you've gone through a bunch of my stuff or any of the stuff that I did on Genesis 3. Mm-hmm. I know you left me some comments about some of it, but so much of it was kind of that similar type of story where I was like, okay, I kind of think it's like this. You kind of start off with a very traditional view and everything. And then as I began to study more and more and more, like the Lord just started to kind of illuminate things. And actually that is how my friends described my experiences. They would say like, oh, wow, like that's an amazing revelation that God gave to you. And I was honestly surprised that was how they were describing it, was like as if I received a revelation from the Lord about the text. And the beautiful thing was exactly like you're saying is that, yeah, I'm number one today. I'm completely convinced of my views concerning Genesis 3:16, 14, 15, and those things. And yeah, the more important thing is I think I have the evidence to back it up. And so that's one of the things I'm looking forward to you explaining more about Daniel's 70th week, because you are the type of meticulous person that is not going to just go at a whim, but instead you're here to explain in detail and show the connections. And one last thing I want to say about connections, because I listen to a lot of scholars and I just think that so many of them today, they're just crazy. To give one example, they often say like, oh, there's no Satan in Genesis, and First John isn't talking about Genesis. One connection is an accident. Two connections is a coincidence. Three is a pattern, and patterns are evidence. And so to me, anytime you make 3+ connections, it's, really, really solid. And I'd say 3 is a pattern. 4 is just written in stone. Like you make 4 connections, like, no, that's it. Like the discussion should be practically over. So, all right. So Daniel's 70th week. Now, yeah, if you could give us a little bit of preamble. So Daniel's 70th week is found in Daniel chapter 9, and it is a cornerstone for some people and their belief systems regarding the end times. Just to give a little bit of history. Some people believe, that Daniel 70 week is over. Some people believe it is yet to come. And the reason that it stands out is that Daniel's prophesying, and he's talking about these things, and he talks about 69 weeks, and then just kind of leaves off the 70th week, and it's like, wait, there's something missing here, right? And so that's my super
Right.
rudimentary explanation. And yeah, so you tell us. And now what?
Okay. So where would you where would you like to start? There's so many different avenues we could take.
Yeah, so number one, let's just
Like,
start with something super basic. And that would be, do you believe that the number seven has any symbolic meaning? Do you believe that the number seven has any symbolic
absolutely.
meaning? Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
to understand the 70 weeks, we really need to first understand what the number seven symbolizes in Scripture. Uh, it they're similar to other parts of Daniel and Scripture as a whole. Numbers have symbolic meaning, and in the case of seven, it's a number of perfection or finality. Most people agree with that, of creation. It took God 7 days to make the creation, and after which it was done, and He rested on that seventh day. The Sabbath day and Sabbath years were instituted then as a way of commemorating God's acts of creation and God's resting on that day. Both of these special years look forward to God's restoration of fallen man. And what I'm referring to there, and I got a little bit ahead of myself, was these years. I'm speaking about are the concept of a year of Jubilee and the year, like a Sabbath year, okay? To discuss the Sabbath years first, Sabbath years were basically just every 7 years, Israel was supposed to leave their land lie fallow. They weren't supposed to farm it, okay? They were supposed to let the land rest. That comes from the law. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, they were actually supposed to store up 2 years worth of food. God was supposed to bless them with 2 years worth of food prior to that seventh year, so that they could, survive while they let the land rest. There was another special year that reflected this, and that was the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee was a year. It was a period of 7 Sabbath years, and the year after that was called the year of Jubilee. And similar to the Sabbath years, the year of Jubilee was supposed to be a time when all debts would be forgiven, all slaves would be freed, and it was associated with redemption and forgiveness. But again, that all ties back to the number 7. Now, it's interesting. One key point I want to mention about the year of Jubilee, though, and it's related to the number 7, but we'll have to come back to it later, is it was actually wasn't the last year in the sequence of 7 sevens. It was the year after that. It was the 50th year, and that's important to realize. It was the start of the next cycle of sevens that made it special. That factors into a lot of my other interpretations that relate to Daniel's 70 weeks. But I want to focus on the number 7 right now because it'll give significance to the number 50 and the number 8 later on, which is important. The Now this pattern of sevens, of 7 sevens, it comes up again in the another special celebration, and that was the Feast of Weeks. The Feast of Weeks was a period of 7 weeks following the Passover. And the New Testament term for the Feast of Weeks, where it was descended on the early church. Now, just like the year of Jubilee, Pentecost was special because it was the day following the 7 sevens. Right? So, and you can see that it was special because we're in Pentecost, and it's pentagon, a pentagram. It was focused on the 50th day, the day starting the next cycle of sevens. Okay, so, and these special holidays, how the number 7 was used to commemorate the creation. You see this symbolism very early on in the Bible. In Genesis, you see how the Bible plays on it in the law repeatedly. But then when you get to the very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, it is just littered with references to the number 7. And it makes sense given that it is a book concerning final things, that it would make a lot of allusions to the number. So what we have here in the reflection of that, and that it is focused on an intensified redemption. Okay, so that, I think, lends a lot of credence to this idea that there's some specific symbolism involved with the number 7, the 77s. So I don't see, what these weeks actually symbolized and what they may have been predicting.
Okay, so now with all of that, so number one, I think it's important. This is one reason why most people or some people are not dispensationalists. Because dispensationalists want to take everything pretty literally, but then they have trouble with symbolism. They don't really appreciate symbolism, right? So, and it seems to me like, yeah, you're willing to say, like, look, there are symbols here that have meaning, right? There are symbols here that have meaning. We shouldn't just say, like, oh, it says it's a leopard, so it's a leopard, right? So now, let me ask you this.
Yep.
Let me ask you this. Should we think that Daniel's 70 weeks are connected with Jesus? Does Jesus play a role in this account of Daniel's 69 or 70 weeks?
Yes. Yes, I certainly believe that it does. There are people that don't believe that. And I think they're partly right too. We'll talk about that later on as I get to discussing this. But I think it definitely has something to do with Jesus. He's at least partially in focus here.
So when it comes to this, I remember you mentioning something about there's something significant about 69 weeks, the 62, the 7, and the last one, or something like this. It was difficult for me to understand because this is not my area of expertise. But what is significant about the numbers? Why does it end on 69? These kind of notions in the book of Daniel.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, yeah, if we want to talk about the divisions there, the divisions are difficult. I think that they make a lot of sense, but they can be difficult to appreciate because they are based on a lot of biblical precedents, just like with the days of creation, all of that. We had to go back through the Bible and even forward in the Bible to see how the New Testament, what the Bible was trying to get at with those symbols. I think it's the same thing with the division of the 70 weeks. But to understand it, you really need to go back to some key portions of Scripture. The 7 probably seems somewhat obvious. It's just, I don't know. It's like a recursive reference to the number 7, to finality within the 70 weeks itself. That of course, it starts with. It's made that there's going to be another. It seems natural that there would be another 7, referenced in there. The 62 and the 1 at the end is what starts kind of throwing people for a loop. Now, the thing these things are so hard to explain in a concise manner without making without taking you all the way back through certain passages of the Bible. I think maybe one thing that I could say, a simple thing I could say about it is, just like I was talking earlier about the 50th day and the 50th year, like the 50th day of the Feast of Weeks and the 50th year of the Year of Jubilee, them being the start of a new cycle of 7s, that's why those days were so important, that they were the beginning of a new cycle. You see the same thing with the number 8. Okay, really, that's what the 50th day and the 50th year were. They were the start of the 8th cycle. Okay, and you can see that played on in the Bible too. When Jesus rose on Sunday, you might expect Jesus would have rose on the Sabbath, that being the final day, if he's the final prophet, if he's the Messiah who's going to usher in the final things. Why he should rise on the Sabbath? No, he rose on Sunday, the Son's day. And that happens to be the 8th day. And there's so many other ways that this number 8 comes into play here. But just 2 quick observations that we'll have plenty of opportunity to expound on later is the fact that Daniel's the 62 weeks are effectively wrapped in a number 8. Okay, there's a 7 on one side and a 1 on the other, and smack dab in the middle you've got this number 62, which just happens to be 8 less than 70. Okay, that's important because there's another number that is very significant eschatologically, typologically speaking, and that is the number 42, which the meaning of that might not be so obvious, but the significance of that is that it is 8 less than 50. Okay, so you have 2 numbers here that have a somewhat obvious relationship to the number 8 that pertain to eschatology, and Daniel happens to be, well, he makes some implied references to that number 42. They're not explicit references, but you can see that they're there once you go back through the other references in the Bible. Okay, but the 62, that's the one that is probably the most pertinent one to your question. I don't believe it's a coincidence that the 62 is also the age of Darius the Mede when he took over Babylon, when he conquered Babylon. That's an important observation there. So I don't think that can be an accident. And there are several other people in the Bible that had references to the number 62 as well. Just to name a few, Obed-Edom, who was the caretaker of the temple treasures in Solomon's temple, he had 62 descendants, or at least there's one location where it's recorded that he had 62 descendants. And the number 62 goes all the way back to the early chapters of Genesis in, I believe it was the age of Jared when he gave birth to Enoch, which he was distinct from the other early patriarchs for some reason. We could have an opportunity to discuss those maybe some other time, but also King Josiah. Okay, he was like the last good king of Israel, or Judah, I believe it was, and he actually reigned for 31 years, which is half of 62. And he was actually the anticipation of the entire books of Kings and Chronicles. Like, he was the culmination of the messianic expectation revealed through Josiah. So the number 62 itself has a lot of allusions or references to it back in the Old Testament, but some of those won't become clear until we talk about some of these other issues that are pertinent to just understanding the prophecies of Daniel and what he was really trying to get across with the 70 weeks and his 4 kingdoms, all of that. So just some high level stuff. I know that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now. It seems like I'm jumping all over scripture, but I assure you, I'm not just grasping at straws here to make some connection. There are definite connections to all of those things, but Daniel was picking up on those, and I think God planted those things as subtle indicators of his ultimate messianic plan. Okay, and some of that is reflected here in Daniel in the way that it's divided up. I don't think we can really appreciate that, though, without going through the 70 weeks here, looking at some of the other elements of Daniel's prophecy and how they demonstrate that there's some really odd things going on with this prophecy. It's not at all what it appears to be on the surface. So I don't know if that's exactly what you were looking for in terms of a response there to the divisions of Daniel 70 weeks or not, but that's just what I could think of off the top of my head.
So what is the point of this prophecy? What is Daniel trying to get at?
Right. Well, ultimately, it does point to the Messiah. It also discusses the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes. There's a dual aspect to the prophecy. And you'll find that this is the case with many biblical prophecies concerning Day of the Lord judgment events, like those predicted in some portions of Daniel. So ultimately, what I've found with the 70 weeks is that it is emphasizing, it's speaking of two things simultaneously throughout the prophecy. Now, it might seem weird that God would do something like that, but again, this is one of those things that, to me, is one of the clearest, strongest evidences that this is a book that is divine in origin, because it doesn't cater to human expectations. Okay, God just does what he wants to do, and he just put it out there. He knew it was going to be confusing. He knew people were going to have a hard time understanding it. I mean, you look at all the theories about what Daniel's 70 weeks was really predicting, and how it actually lines up with history. There's tons of theories on it, and none of them actually align 100% perfectly with any significant events in history. Now, you get an approximate idea, of when certain things were going to happen in the life of Antiochus Epiphanes, but also in the life of the Messiah, but they don't work out exactly. And I think ultimately God's purpose in making this prophecy, just as it was in all other prophecies, was, yes, it's to point towards the Messiah, to point towards messianic events, but it's also a very convincing demonstration that this was from the God. Okay, it wasn't. This wasn't just a human endeavor where the skeptics claim that Daniel, in particular, made some serious historical blunders, both in terms of what he predicted and what he understood about past history, and they make him out to look like a fool. And in many ways, I think that was actually deliberate on God's part. But if you're willing to look past it and see what else He was doing there, you're really in for some amazing surprises.
So with that, what did it mean to the immediate audience, I guess you could say? Because like were they hearing this as mostly a messianic view, or were they hearing this in a different way that stood out to them more historically in their direct context?
Yeah, I think it was probably a mixed bag. I think people who were really familiar with the scriptures, they maybe made some of these connections. Other people, they probably didn't. I mean, Daniel himself, he was the interpreter of riddles. He was the chief astrologer, and he couldn't figure it out. So even like Daniel 8, which is one of the most plain prophecies in the Bible, he said he was just baffled at the end of it. He couldn't understand it. So when you get to Jesus' time frame, clearly people were expecting the Messiah around that time, and the only place the Bible really gives any indication as to when the Messiah was going to show up is in Daniel 9. Okay, so right or wrong, it's at least clear from history that some people were interpreting, or more than some people were interpreting Daniel's prophecies in the 70 weeks here to be pertaining to the Messiah. How much of that they discerned on their own, or it was just kind of handed down to them from the experts, the scribes or whatever. I can't say, but Messianic fervor was definitely in full swing in the first century, early first century, and so I think people did understand that Daniel 9 had something to do with the Messiah, but I think there's more to it. But so it's just hard to say, what the most common belief was, because I honestly think some of this stuff has been lost to history. I think some of this might have been documented beforehand, but given the power of it, I think it's likely that some of this stuff, the commentary on some of these passages that maybe would reveal some of this stuff, was the documents that we lost, that were successfully destroyed as part of the resistance to Christianity's spread. And fortunately, at least the word itself was preserved. But I think the early interpretations that would have made some of these things clear may have been lost. I can't prove that, but I suspect that, given how compelling some of these things might be, that this truly was the writing of God, that those things might have been targets for suppression.
So my cousin has often remarked that he thinks like the Magi basically came from a school of Daniel, and that they had maybe some of these other types of interpretations and stuff like that, and that's how they knew where and when the Messiah was going to be born, and that's why they show up, because they had a much more clear vision that like, oh yeah, dude, this is the sign. The Messiah is here. He's come. And so since they had this knowledge, they were willing to make this massive trek all the way over to see the Messiah. You find that plausible?
Right. Absolutely. Have you done any research into the Star of Bethlehem at all?
I've heard a few friends give me some ideas about this. I haven't actually personally done it. I've heard some really interesting stuff. One of them, they proposed that, yeah, Jesus is actually born on September 11th, and there's some astrological signs that are supposed to do this. Now, I heard
Bingo.
somebody.
Bingo.
So, yeah, I would like to do it more where I actually have it all completely in my brain. But I have heard like this idea, and somebody else was mentioning this idea. Yeah, there's like these three king stars, Regulus, and some other ones, and yeah, somehow they all match up. But yeah, to me, that's one I'll get around to doing a more full thought and explanation down the road sometime. But it has been fascinating just to see like the legacy that Daniel seems to leave behind. He does more than simply write down these few things, but he actually leaves a legacy behind for more people, under him to understand and to see. So
Yep.
now,
Yep, for sure.
so with the 70th week, what would you say are kind of two different views? What's one of the main views that basically says the 70th week is over and done? And what's maybe the other view that says the 70th week is only future, never been accomplished, never happened?
All right. Well, the dispensationalists, I think, are the predominant ones who believe that Daniel's 70th week is yet future. A preterist perspective on that would say that it was all fulfilled, and that there really was nothing that went unfulfilled in all of the 70 weeks. I don't take either position myself. I think, again, like many times is the case, I think one side has part of the truth, the other side has part of the truth, and the reality lies somewhere in the middle.
I gotcha. So if the truth is somewhere in the middle, then should we be viewing this 70 week period as a serious aspect of our eschatology? Should it play a key role in parts of our eschatology?
Uh, I'm sorry, Adam. You broke up a little bit there. I
Yeah.
couldn't quite
Should
make out what you were asking.
should we take the 70th week as a key part, as playing a key role in our eschatology and how we understand the end times?
Well, yeah, I think it is a significant portion of the prophecy, and in that it can play a role in combating particular heresies, especially those of like full preterism, and that the 70th week embodies so much more than what I think either dispensationalists or preterists would attribute to it. So yeah, I think it really is important. I don't know, how much detailed information it's expected we can expect to get from it, but there are some gems in it that I think are foundational to demonstrating some historical Christian beliefs, and they help make a lot of sense out of some other eschatological passages too. Things that I had thought that I had fully understood in my preterist days. I now realize there was a whole other side of what was being discussed in a lot of prophecies in the Old and New Testament, and it has radically changed my view on many aspects of Scripture, and my and I guess I wouldn't say it's radically changed my eschatology, but it's confirmed for me that many aspects, foundational aspects to the Christian view of eschatology were correct, and that we can use these to demonstrate that many progressive forms of Christianity that would try to change those understandings aren't they're not viable. That there's too much evidence conflicting with their view that would suggest that it would just take it completely off the table. That there's no way that could possibly be the proper understanding of that. And as like I was saying, I had a run-in with full preterism there. I was convinced of that, convinced of full preterism for a while. And these kinds of observations are really what convinced me that was not correct. Even after I'd lost my faith over it, and I'd come back to it, these are the things that really led me back, and at the same time proved that there are many tenets of preterism that are just not not true at all.
What kind of things would you say that your view kind of confirms about Christianity? How does the 70 weeks like kind of help confirm or shore up our beliefs?
I think it demonstrates that there will be, or in other portions of prophecy that exhibit the same sort of traits that Daniel 70th week, or Daniel 77s and the 70th week in particular, make clear, and that is essentially that there will be a future judgment of the wicked and the righteous. There will be a physical, biological resurrection of them both. That Christ will return bodily in our future in his glorified resurrected body, and he will set up a eternal kingdom on a regenerated earth, okay, where it will be restored to, or maybe surpass the Edenic conditions found early in Genesis. There are branches of Christianity today that would deny those things are actually true, and that many of those things had already been fulfilled in the first century, and that all that remains is for us to die, take on our spiritual bodies, and be with God in heaven. And that is surprisingly difficult to convince somebody against once you start going down the route to preterism. And it to get me out of that, it took these kinds of observations to really solidify in my mind, yes, these biblical authors were looking forward to something much more significant than what happened in the first century in physical terms, and in terms of judgment on earthly Israel, and what awaits each individual Christian whenever they are resurrected. Well, they don't believe in a resurrection. For them, it's whenever you die. That's when you experience a spiritual resurrection. But I think but the problem with that is they take symbolism to an extreme, and it just seems like they are willing to accept anything that would pass as fulfillment or an explanation for how something could have been fulfilled in the past or fulfilled spiritually. They just accept it, and it does kind of fit, okay, but combating it and actually demonstrating that somebody hasn't interpreted the symbols properly is challenging. And I think that's just a general reflection on Christianity generally not taking the symbols of the Bible very seriously and conducting your due diligence to make sure that you understand things correct. There's so many things about prophecy that somebody just sees some passing similarity to something else, and they'll say that was what this was referring to. Well, how do you know that? And then that's where it becomes a real challenge. And without some of these principles that would come up in our discussion here on Daniel and the 70 weeks, you can't really be sure or have that much certainty that you've interpreted the symbols that are obviously there. They're obviously symbolic, but what do they mean? That's the challenge. So I think this really helps shore up our faith too, and could help in terms of unifying Christians as well, because I think you kind of get locked into some pretty solid interpretations. It's hard to say, well, that's your opinion. I see this as a different way. Looking at some of the evidence here, it's like, wow, that seems like the only answer that fits all of the evidence.
Yeah. And data is so important. It's so important, to be able to look and analyze, and that's kind of what I find with different explanations. Like, poor explanations kind of have some answers for a few bits of data, but a really, really good answer seems to account for pretty much all of the data. And I think that sometimes we stop short as biblical students when we find like a few connections, and we're just kind of like, oh, that's good enough, and you just run with it. But then, if you take somebody else, they actually have the rest of the answers. That can be really, really crucial, and kind of going like, oh, wait, there's more. If you sit here and dig a little longer, there's way more in here than simply just the surface level.
Yep, absolutely.
So what would you say has been something surprising that you learned through your study of Daniel's 70th week that you just didn't expect?
I guess I didn't really expect how much it was drawing our attention back to other passages in Scripture. That there are tons of ways that the 70th week draws our attention back to a lot of passages in the Old Testament, and even within Daniel, how interwoven some of those passages are. I mean, it can be pretty obvious that there's a relationship between some of these passages, but I guess even from like a preterist perspective, when you're reading through a lot of Daniel and you see the parallels between some of the passages in one location and passages to another, you generally don't think that they're directly related. That maybe they're typologically related, but they're not as interwoven as I think it can be demonstrated that they are. I think another thing I was really surprised about. Okay, so we're just talking about the 70 weeks here. I guess too. I'm amazed at how clear and obvious the what I call the dual references are within the 70 weeks and the other passages, that there are the parallel passages within Daniel, because there's just such immense focus on the splitting of things in half or the doubling of things, and they're subtle, and I've not seen many people pick up on them, but they're definitely there. I don't. I mean, I've never had a debate with anybody where we could debate these things. Man, that would be a monster debate too. But I'm just surprised at how some of these things could have been overlooked too for as long as they have been. I mean, it's really hard for me to believe that I'm the one that figured this out. That's shocking to me.
Yeah.
And it's so obvious. It's so obvious when you're done with it that this. I believe this is the proper understanding. It's like, how could nobody have ever made these connections? It seems so simple once it's all laid out for you, but getting there has been an immense challenge for humanity, and I have a hard time believing I'm anything that special that God would have revealed it to me.
Well, you know what, Carmine? I just keep quoting. Sometimes even if somebody's like, "Well, why do you think you're so special? Why do you think that you have the correct answer, Adam? What's wrong with you?"
Yeah.
And it's like, well, God has chosen the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. So there you go. Man.
Right, right, yeah, and that fits right in with this idea here too. In some ways, God made himself out to be the fool, to look like the fool to those who really didn't want him anyway. But if you're willing to look past the surface, you can see he's right there, and he's no fool. He knows exactly what he's doing.
And I remember that you actually connect some of these ideas to Revelation, in where Revelation, John is writing about is it 1260 days, or I don't remember the number exactly, but he splits a couple of these things. And so you make this numerological symbolic connection here.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of ways. Revelation plays on Daniel big time. And there are many ways Daniel anticipated what Revelation had to say. In some ways, we shouldn't really be surprised by some of those things. But yeah, the 1,260 days is actually parallel to many of these passages we find in Daniel. You don't find the 1,260 day expression in Daniel, but you find parallel ideas. And it's the book of Revelation, specifically chapters 11 through 13, that make that relationship clear. So the 1,260 days is another way of saying the times and half a time that occurs within Daniel. That phrase doesn't occur here in Daniel 9, but it does occur in some passages that have a lot in common with Daniel 9, particularly Daniel 7 and Daniel 12. Okay, there's a lot of overlap between what is going on in those passages and what we see here in Daniel 9. But it's the book of Revelation that really provides the stronger evidence that or I would maybe say it just goes a long way towards confirming what you could infer, inference from what you read in Daniel. But Revelation goes and makes it explicit, and it does it in several different ways too. It's amazing. I'm sure we'll have time to talk about them at some point, but there's a lot of overlap there between the numerology, and I hate calling it numerology because right off the bat that puts a bad taste in people's mouth. It's not so much numerology, where you're just grasping. I don't. It's the way people interpret the general symbols of the Bible, where they're just willing to, take some passing similarity and say, "Oh, this means something," specific here. It's really easy to do the same thing with numbers, okay? But I think there, with the frequency that numbers occur, and with some of the bizarre numbers that show up here in Daniel, okay, and how they all end up pointing to the same thing by the time you're said and done with it, and it dovetails so well with what we see happening so many other places in Scripture from the very beginning, from the book of Genesis, and the way that it dovetails with Revelation, and even the words of Jesus, specifically with regard to this idea of the author's intent to make dual references within the words that they're saying, that to be speaking simultaneously about two different things that are related, but maybe pertain to vastly different time periods. I think there's just too much evidence to say that the numbers don't mean something, and that if they mean something, they were intentionally put there, and that we have the facilities to understand what God was intending to say. And ultimately it's very simple. It's not like these are conclusions. They're very reasonable once you see the evidence for them, drawing parallels between some number that I've seen in Revelation versus something that I saw in the newspaper or something like that. It's nothing like that. It's this very basic intuition that anybody can see. And you were saying about the number, this fairly small number of connections that you can make before it becomes something that is pretty much the ultimate truth. You get far more indicators than that for all regarding duality in biblical prophecy. It's literally everywhere. I don't see how anybody could successfully argue or maintain the belief that the Bible, the prophets of the Bible, did not intentionally plant seeds and leave obvious indicators that when they were speaking of something, oftentimes it was typological of something greater than itself, or they actually were speaking of two different things simultaneously.
Yeah. It kind of had like its immediate referent and kind of its foreshadowing of an ultimate referent, kind of like what we see with Jesus, right, in typology. And you have this, kind of the idea of Moses is this Messiah who leads the children of Israel out of Egypt, but then this is ultimately fulfilled in Christ, right? And so you kind of have these continued typologies throughout, and that, Daniel and the book of John and Revelation, they're all kind of doing things like this, where they kind of have these some sort of duality in some cases.
Right. But the trick, that's an easy claim to make. And that's one of the criticisms that skeptics of Christianity are oftentimes quick to throw at them, given some of the apparently tenuous ways like the New Testament authors used Old Testament prophecy as justification for Jesus fulfilling those prophecies. In that it's an easy claim to make, especially when you feel that it's going to serve your purposes, that, hey, this passage may not have sounded like it was talking about Jesus, but that was the ultimate intent. Well, prove it. How can we know for sure that the New Testament authors in many of these cases, were making legitimate use of Old Testament prophecies? And when we make those sorts of claims too about typology, and we're trying to make claims about things that maybe the New Testament authors never even made themselves, how can you demonstrate that secondary reference there was really intended, and that you're not really reading into the text more than what it says, perhaps because you're biased and you want it to support support your case, your belief. If we were to take some of those passages to a modern day Jew, and say that these passages were speaking about the Messiah in a certain way, how could you prove that to them? And I know there are ways that Christians try to do that, but I think they're ultimately flawed and weak arguments. Whereas I think what I've tried to do is make that case as strong as I possibly can. And in many cases, I think that I did. I have succeeded to a great extent. I guess we'll see once word starts getting out about these things here. But even in Daniel's 70 weeks, there are a lot of honest skeptics that would look at that and say, that's not speaking about Jesus at all. That was fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes, the primary focus of Daniel and other cases. I mean, that's a view that is held within universities today, in the secular schools, and that even among some conservatives now they're adopting this view that Daniel was predominantly about what happened during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean uprising that resisted him, and it doesn't say anything specific. There's not even a secondary intended reference to the Messiah, and they make some good points. I'm not saying all of their points are solid, but they do make some good points, enough to where it could make somebody with a sincere heart but a weak faith really question that. So those are the kinds of people I've been trying to cater to here, because I was that sort of skeptic myself, and I could see the truth on both. Both sides made some good points, but they both seem to be missing something, and just needed to settle my own mind on it. And this is where I ended up landing.
Yeah, and I know we've talked a little bit about this idea that, if you're an honest skeptic, I actually encourage the honest skeptics to truly study the Bible, to truly study many of these passages. And for me, it's quite annoying when one of them confronts me and they say, oh yeah, but what about this Bible passage and this Bible passage? And when it's so apparent that their alleged contradiction is very easily answered, that they've just completely either misunderstood the text, taken a banned translation, and it's like, okay, are you guys even trying anymore? Like, you guys just aren't really using any even difficult examples. You're just kind of bringing up things that seem completely whack. And like, only if you take some sort of extreme example and read the text in bad faith can you come to the conclusion that this is an issue.
Right. Yeah. In terms of like claimed Bible contradictions and stuff, yeah, I was never super impressed with some of the answers I got concerning the contradictions. Okay. I think that the skeptics have a stronger case when they start coming at us concerning prophecy, where they aren't necessarily contradictions so much, but are we being honest with the text in a lot of cases, and are we reading things into the text, especially in the Old Testament, that really weren't intended by the authors, and were the New Testament authors trying to? I mean, I think it's clear enough that they were trying to at least pass off what they saw happen, what they claim they were seeing happening in their day, as fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. But at the same time, many of those fulfillments seem somewhat strained to somebody who is wanting to see some reasonable evidence that something is true. I'm not sure if you've ever dealt with skeptics who make those particular claims, and how you answered them. But I always found those claims to be reasonably compelling. And I know there's ways Christians try to combat that, but I honestly, even today, I refrain from making those sorts of those arguments because I don't really feel they hold water. I mean, maybe they're true. I'm not saying that they're definitely not true, but if I just always felt there had to be something better, something more substantial than what I had heard from other apologists concerning the Bible's messianic prophecy, specifically the prophecies that that pertain to the eschaton, to the eschatological prophecies, not just the ones that look forward to the Messiah, but the ones that actually looked forward to the whatever end the Bible was looking to. And again, I think I've found satisfactory evidence, more than satisfactory evidence for that, but it's not the kind of evidence that you hear propagated by common apologists.
Right. And this is also why I feel like, yeah, we have to do our job. We got to do our job in explaining and shouting and putting our information out there. And I know for myself, I will just plead guilty that I haven't done a good enough job in expounding and pushing out there and showing, other things that I'm like, look, I know this is an unpopular view, but it is very grounded in what the Bible says, and I feel like demonstrably true. And I feel like that's what your claim is that not only are you making some just claims, and because trust me, yes, I've seen those other people that come along with I have a new interpretation of a scripture passage. And you're like, oh, that would be really cool and really interesting. And then you kind of look into it and it's like, yeah, it all falls apart. Like it doesn't work for this reason or that reason or fill in the blank. But I think that there are some of these that I have been surprised by and just going like, holy cow, like this is the right understanding of the Bible. This is what the Bible is saying. And even though there were sometimes very unpopular views, or actually not views at all, nobody had this view, right? It's not even in the public discourse. You're bringing something new to the table.
Right.
And so I find those to be, yes, a little disheartening at times. They're exciting at first and then disheartening on another level to know that most of the public discourse concerning certain Bible passages they're just not even in the ballpark of having a good conversation.
Yep.
So let's see here. I want to skip around a little bit, and because I was curious if you could tell me more about this jewels notion in Ezekiel 28. So this is Ezekiel 28, and then Revelation 20. Is it 21 or 22? And these have to do with these many missing jewels idea.
Oh, right. Yeah. So Ezekiel 28, just to summarize there, it is a prophecy that was made concerning the
priesthood.
The king of
Levitical priesthood.
I'm sorry. Yep. So I think maybe I lost you for a little bit. What about the Levitical priesthood?
Yeah, they had a breastplate with jewels on it.
Can you hear me?
Right? Yeah. We're back now.
Yeah. Yep. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, there are a lot of connections there between the high priest's breastplate, the jewels that were included in it, the jewels that adorned the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28, and the jewels that adorned the foundation of the New Jerusalem in Revelation. I think it's Revelation 22. I'm not 100% sure on that.
It's 21 or 22.
But in yeah, but yeah, the same 12 gemstones show up, except in Ezekiel 28. There in our Western translations, three of those stones are missing. Okay, however, that's not true in all translations. In the Septuagint version of Ezekiel 28, they're all there. Okay, so all 12 of them are there.
Really?
They're very specific gemstones. It's not like they're just 12 of the same stone or something. Is they're each, they're each they each have a unique name. But yeah, the Septuagint does record all 12 in Ezekiel 28. It's the Masoretic text that we inherited from the Masoretes that doesn't have it. I have different theories as to why that might have been. I think it seems kind of likely that because of the association with the King of Tyre and what I think the proper interpretation of, what is said of the King of Tyre here and what is said about him in other key passages too, I think there may have been this inkling, or maybe more than an inkling, that God was speaking about them, that he was speaking about the Jews through this, or the high priest, specifically the Aaronic priesthood, through this king, and maybe he was speaking specifically of judgment on them, and that maybe they just removed a few. They couldn't get rid of all of them. That would be too obvious. But maybe they just removed three of them. Maybe it would make the association less obvious. Now, I think to a degree that was true, that God was speaking of at least the law. Okay, he wasn't so much in. Maybe he was saying something about the priesthood itself, but I'm not saying it's that this necessarily indicated, that there was something necessarily evil about them, or that it indicated judgment to eventually befall them, but that it was more concerning the fate of their function in God's economy. Basically, that the law had a shelf life, that the priesthood had a shelf life, and that God was not always going to use that, and that it was going to end up falling by the wayside, similar to the way that the King of Tyre is described. So I wouldn't say. I think they maybe slightly misunderstood, or they could have slightly misunderstood what was being spoken of there, taken it more harshly than it may have been intended to be, and that accounts for the missing stones. I don't know. That's just a theory, but as far as our interpretation goes, though, I think it's a safe bet that the Septuagint version is the original version. That association was there, and there's so many of those stones, and they're all unique. I mean, it can't be a coincidence. I mean, there's your three point test. You've got this usage regarding the priesthood, especially the high priest, and the King of Tyre here, and what you see happening in Revelation. There's got to be some sort of connection there. No, what is that? What is that connection? That's something that we can explore. But it sounded like you were surprised that you can account for those three missing gemstones there, that maybe you were unaware that there was a translation of Ezekiel 28 that did include all 12.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that before and stuff like that. And it's definitely interesting, for it to be in the Septuagint, but not the Masoretic text. And so, I don't know, if there is, I mean, I was almost starting to wonder about like the idea of like, oh, is it like just the idea of that there's a third missing or there's a fourth missing? Perhaps there's other symbolic imagery that you know, I, like I said, a friend brought this up to me a while ago and kind of showing this connection, and so I kind of took a little bit of a glance at it, but I could never really piece it together. I could never really figure out like, yeah, why are there missing gemstones there? Um, because there are other people that have kind of noted like, yeah, it's got most of them there. And actually, yeah, my buddy Ryan noted that, in one of our last conversations we did on Genesis 3, he's like, oh, wow, like, yeah, here's a whole bunch of the gemstones that remind you of Israel. And so I don't know. I don't know what the significance is. So it's just kind of interesting. I don't know. My only other thought that reminds me of it is the idea of like the separation of Judah and the rest of Israel, and like was there a difference during the time of Ezekiel? So my history during the time of Ezekiel is not that great. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I do have my own ideas on how, what is actually going on there, and it may not be surprising that I think the king of Tyre wasn't the ultimate reference being made in Ezekiel 28 there. That there was something deeper going on, that he was used as an occasion to speak of the influence that undergirds all nations, all people, in terms of the things that influence them to rebel against God, to do things that God doesn't want them to do, and that he was ultimately speaking of the fate of that underlying influence, and so that ties in with the 70 weeks here. I don't think we'd have time to talk about all of them. I really don't think we could squeeze them in the time that we have left. But
Probably not.
There are many things about that. Yeah, there are many things about that king, though, and what is said about him that makes it clear that God is speaking to the accuser, basically, and that's what you have in the law. That the law was described as the accuser, but Satan himself, is also described as an accuser, and they are joined together in a shared fate in the book of Revelation too, and in other ways, including this king of Tyre, who elsewhere, incidentally, associated with the 70th weeks here. I just feel like we get off onto tangents and stuff here, which is really easy to do when you have all these biblical precedents that you need to evaluate to help interpret some of these texts. But the king of Tyre was actually told that he would. Oh, what is I forget the reference there, but I forget. I think it was saying that he, after a judgment that he would experience, that he would return to, or at least Tyre, the city of Tyre, which is described as a female, okay, in female terms, as a prostitute, that she would return to her trade as a prostitute after 70 years. And there are other references to a 70-year period too. There aren't many of them, but each one of them, when you look at them, they all seem to have some sort of association with the eschaton, with eschatology, that there's a final thing that they're looking towards. And I think that's definitely what you have here in the King of Tyre, and that it is ultimately a reference to Satan. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that the New Jerusalem, okay, search in Revelation, is resting on a foundation of those same gemstones. And I think, given the way the church is said to treat Satan and the wicked in general, they're described as trampling them, crushing them under their feet, and specifically there are passages that speak of the church, of Satan actually being crushed under their feet, and of course that goes back to Genesis. Okay, that the what the Messiah would do to the serpent, and there's other things we could say about the King of Tyre and how those passages end up. It goes beyond chapter 23. It goes all the way to chapter 27. God is speaking of the King of Tyre all the way through those passages, and those passages just happen to end up with the multi-headed serpent Leviathan being judged. And I think Revelation, the reason it's got the foundation stones that adorn this king, and they happen to adorn the high priest, is that it is a image of the church crushing Satan. The church is being built on top of Satan there. Now, it's also described as being built on the foundation of the apostles too. I think both are true. That is yet another way I think duality is expressed in the prophecies of Revelation. And there are other ways that emphasizes duality too. In particular, Jesus, his term, the way that he described his coming in judgment, that demonstrates that he was speaking more than just about the temporal judgment or the immediate judgment that he was going to bring on the earth, specifically the land of Israel, that he was speaking of two different comings all in the same breath. But that's I guess that's another topic for another time. Maybe the more impressive thing at the moment, given the knowledge or the ideas that we've talked about right now, is just the fact that the Bible used this imagery in multiple ways and played on things that were explicitly stated elsewhere.
Let's look at ending on this one, because I think this one is very interesting, and it's very interesting to me because it is pretty much a historical fact, and it is the idea of the year 70 AD. And so I thought about, just on a surface level, this idea of the 70 weeks of Daniel coming to an end at the 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem sounded just poetic, just by any fashion. And so I wanted to know what you think about 70 AD. And yeah, does that fulfill some prophetic elements? What is it, should we be looking to 70 AD as being related to, in any way, some of these other connections?
Yeah, good question. Yes, I definitely think it is spoken of. I think that's really hard to avoid that conclusion. I think preterists have a pretty strong case there that is in view here. As far as the 70, that's a bit wishy-washy. It's tempting to see some significance in the 70 there. I guess the year itself comes down to when Christ was actually born. Okay, and I don't know that. I think we're off a bit on that. Not as much as scholars typically think. I don't think it's like 7 years or 6 or 7 years like that. I think maybe it's off by at least a couple years. Okay, and it goes back to the Star of Bethlehem. If it's truly what I believe that it was, and that's not my theory. This is something I've learned from other people, but I think you make a really, really good case for it, that the 70-year mark of 70 AD, I'm not sure that has a solid significance. It might have some significance in terms of an approximation, which I, of course, think these intervals in Daniel ultimately are, that they are approximations, but that their symbolic element and that is maybe the more significant feature of them. But yeah, absolutely, 70 AD was in view, but I think that is why it is so important that we understand these aspects of duality to Daniel, because that was not the end. Okay, Daniel was looking to 70 AD, but he was definitely looking past it, as looking at it as if it were a type or a shadow of something greater than itself to come. And the evidence of that is in the numbers, okay, in both the 70 weeks, in Daniel 8, and Daniel 12, okay, in the 1,290 and the 1,335 days there. The 2,300 mornings and evenings that's mentioned in Daniel 8 is another way that the numbers allude to duality. You mentioned the 1,260 in Revelation in reference to the judgment that Christ said he was going to execute on his generation. Okay, that is discussed in the book of Revelation too, but it's in conjunction with other phrases that are equivalents of that time period. That 1,260 days is also that passage shows up in Revelation 11 through 13, and in each of those chapters there's a different way that that period is phrased. It's also referred to as a time, times, and half a time, which is an expression that comes from Daniel in context like Daniel 12, which explicitly mentions destruction of the sanctuary, and Daniel 9 mentions the destruction of the sanctuary. Revelation 7 uses that same expression. It has its own indicators of duality in the fate of the fourth beast. You can see contextual indicators that really wasn't the end of that beast. It was killed, its body was thrown into the fire, but it was explicitly marked for preservation in that it would rise again. It was expected to rise again, and it would rise again in an empire that looked very much like it. It had a lot of traits to it, and then you can actually extrapolate that. You can see that's the case for all of Daniel's kingdoms, that they're all part of a dual kingdom. But the reason those numbers are so important, they're I forgot one. The 3.5 years. That's another way that Revelation expresses this period of 1,260 days. All of those suggest a 7 that has been cut in half. Okay, and when you look at the biblical symbolism of the number 7, how significant that must be, surely a 7 that is cut perfectly in half must mean something too. Okay, and we just happen to see that in Daniel's 70th week. When it speaks of the Messiah being cut off, he's cut off in the middle of that week. The word that's used there, the Hebrew word that's used there is, I'll probably butcher the pronunciation, but it's written like Hesi. Okay, and literally, if you look it up in a concordance, it means, it's most often translated as half. Okay, so the anointed one in the 70th week is specifically cut off right in the middle of that 7. Now, that must be significant. And what I argue is consistent with all of the other symbols we can look at in Daniel and Revelation and those numbers specifically. They all point in the same direction. They all point to something being cut into half, or there's only half as many things as we would expect there to be based on some biblical precedent, or they're doubles of something specific, or they have two overlapping yet somewhat conflicting ideas that makes it clear that there are two time periods being conflated there. There's a lot to unpack there, but you can go through all of these elements of Daniel and Revelation and many other passages in Scripture. Honestly, you can go all the way back to Genesis and the very first judgment day of the Lord event, okay? The day of the Lord. When you go back there in Genesis and you see God pronounce this judgment on Adam, okay? It says that he would die in the very day that he disobeyed, effectively. Well, that wasn't the only day God was speaking about. There was another day that came along almost 1,000 years later, just as the Bible says that a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. Adam ended up dying 70 years short of 1,000 years in Genesis. All the manuscripts agree on that. All of the manuscripts that we have kind of disagree on some of the ages of the pre-flood patriarchs whenever they died or they had significant events happen in their life. But in the case of Adam, they all agree he died at 930 years, and that just happens to be 70 years short of 1,000 years. That seems like that's got to be significant, right? And actually, you can go to historical records. If you go to the Book of Jubilees, which isn't a Christian document, but is very popular among the Christians and Jews in Jesus' day, you can actually read where that explicit interpretation is given. It says that, it tells us that Adam died 70 years short of 1,000 years. It explicitly says that, and that he died within that day. He calls the thousand years, he calls it a day, and he uses Psalm 90 verse 4 to justify that. Okay, now there are other things that the Book of Jubilees says that I would find tenuous, okay, but that specific thing is too coincidental. I think it confirms very plainly that was God's intent, that this was that day of judgment prefigured a day, or prefigured other days of judgment, including the final day of judgment. And what you see happening in 70 AD was a type, was a foreshadowing of something, a much, much greater judgment. And the evidence of that isn't so much in any particular passage that says that there is going to be such a judgment. It's in the symbols, especially the numbers, that highlight the duality. And getting back to what I was saying about half of 7 there, okay, the half of 7 quite logically would suggest that when you see a context that refers to half of 7, it's referring to, it's an indicator that what you're seeing described in that text pertains to two different eschatological events, okay, that there's an intended dual reference there. So we have those kinds of dual references all through the 70 weeks, okay, but up until verse 70, they're just speaking about the duality of the Christ versus Antichrist theme, okay, that on one hand, it's speaking of Antiochus Epiphanes and Onias III, okay, the high priest, around that time. It's speaking of those individuals, but it's also speaking about the Christ who would come later. But when you get to the 70th week, it's speaking of something beyond that. It's speaking of the Messiah himself, and he is coming. There are going to be two phases to that fulfillment too. So I tried to tie everything back together to the original topic of the show here. But ultimately, yeah, I think that, yeah, 70 AD is very, very significant, but it is not the end by far, and you can demonstrate that in many many ways.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So yeah, we're gonna wrap up, and if you want to check out more about the Book of Daniel, more about all of Carmine's work, you can see him at Daniel Reloaded, and I'll be able to clip a link in the description here. And yeah, for more heady intellectual stuff, uh, yeah, come check out our channel. I'm hoping to, yeah, work out something more where we can have some more intellectual conversations and keep open, honest, biblical content coming. Because I think that it's really important that we can have open dialogues about what the Bible says. And if we're staying inside the framework of the Bible, then that's where we can seriously discuss and be good Bereans. How can you be a good Berean if you're not able to challenge the status quo? Right? So, Carmine, thanks
Yep,
for
yep,
coming out, man.
absolutely.
It's been fun having you.